The man did not die quickly. That was the point. His legs were bound, his hands were shackled. His voice, though hoarse from strangulation, still found breath enough to scream. He had already been dragged for miles through the filthy streets of London, his body rattling against wooden planks as the crowd jeered and spat. He had already been hanged until the world dimmed to black, but not long enough to die. They had cut him down before death could grant mercy. Now, he lay stretched on a bench, limbs secured, surrounded not by executioners, but by agents of the English crown. This was not slaughter, this was sentence, ritual, justice as performed by empire. The knife entered below his navel. The incision was slow, deliberate. Flesh was peeled back. His intestines were pulled out, hand over hand, steaming in the open air. He was still alive. He had to be. That was the requirement. His genitals were removed, burned in front of him. Then came the final mutilation, the removal of his heart and entrails. Only then, after the body had been emptied, was the head taken. This was not chaos, it was order. And the man whose body bore it all was William Wallace. To many, he was a rebel. To others, a freedom fighter. But to the English crown, he was one thing only, a traitor. And the punishment for treason in the early 14th century was not merely death. It was obliteration. The body was no longer a vessel of personhood. It became a message, a billboard of warning. Treason, they believed, had to be punished in a manner that left nothing to martyrdom. The law demanded that the traitor's heart be removed while still beating, that his limbs be severed, his corpse divided and scattered across the realm, his name erased and his memory warped into terror. And so, on August 23rd, 1305, Wallace's body was not just killed, it was processed, not just executed, but dissected in public, as if the state itself needed to lay bare each organ to reassert its own anatomical dominance over rebellion. People often imagine executions as moments of heat and rage, but Wallace's death was something else entirely. It was cold, scripted, sanctified by court orders and royal authority. There were no mistakes. Every knife, every nail, every flame was planned. And in that planning lay the true horror, not that one man suffered, but that an entire system collaborated to turn pain into instruction. This was medieval justice, not at its most brutal, but at its most honest. They wanted him to feel everything. They needed him to be seen as breaking, unraveling, ceasing to exist as a man, so that the message would spread through flesh, through blood, through the image of his face. But that face never gave them what they wanted. Not a cry for forgiveness, not a renunciation, not a broken oath, just eyes that refused to plead. This is not the story of a hero, it is not even the story of a man. It is the story of what a state will do to ensure that no one like him ever rises again. Wallace's execution is remembered because it failed. Because it was so extreme, so surgical, so staged, that the very spectacle meant to erase him made him immortal. And that is the paradox of power when it bleeds too publicly. The more it tries to destroy an idea, the more clearly that idea is seen, especially when it is written in pain. Treason, in the eyes of a king, is not just rebellion, it is humiliation. And William Wallace did not humiliate Edward the Firm by conquering his armies or seizing his throne. He humiliated him by refusing to acknowledge that Edward's rule extended over him. In an age where monarchy claimed divine right, that refusal was a desecration. Wallace was not born to be remembered. He emerged from minor nobility without wealth, without court favor, without inheritance. He was not the heir to power, he was its interruption. Raised in the borderlands of Scottish identity, he was fluent in violence before he was fluent in strategy. His first known act was not speech or treaty, but vengeance. In 1297, Wallace killed William Heselrigg, the English sheriff of Lanark. He did not poison. He did not negotiate. He shattered Hazelrig's skull and sliced his body into pieces. Some accounts say he did it because Hazelrig had killed Wallace's wife. Others suggest the cause was resistance, pure and political. But whatever the reason, the blood was real, and it marked him. From that moment, Wallace was no longer a subject of the crown. He was its declared enemy. Scotland was fractured, not united. The throne was contested. Nobles changed allegiance as tides changed winds. Edward I of England, known as the Hammer of the Scots, took advantage of this chaos. He claimed overlordship over Scotland, installed puppet rulers, and marched armies through towns that had never bent the knee. The legal language of empire dripped with legitimacy, but the reality was occupation. And where nobles hesitated, Wallace advanced. He gathered men not with gold, but with fury, farmers, archers, exiles. His army was not a formation, it was a wound turned into a spear. They moved fast, they struck hard, and at Stirling Bridge in September of 1297, they did the impossible. Against a better armed and numerically superior English force, Wallace and Andrew Moray lured them onto a narrow wooden crossing and slaughtered them. The bridge collapsed under blood and hoof. English bodies choked the river. It was more than a victory, it was a humiliation. For the first time, the myth of English invincibility cracked. Edward was not amused. He returned from his campaigns in France and prepared retribution. Wallace was declared an outlaw, not just a criminal, but a man outside all legal protection. He could be killed without consequence. But Wallace, for a time, rose higher. He was named Guardian of Scotland in the name of the captive King John Balliol. He carried a sword nearly as tall as himself. He wore no crown, but commanded loyalty from those who had sworn none before, and that terrified those who clung to the old systems. Nobles whispered, bishops hesitated. Wallace had no lineage, no court manners. He wore defiance like armor, but that armor cracked at Falkirk. In July 1298, the two forces met again. This time, Edward commanded the English army directly. Wallace's troops, brave but poorly armed, formed defensive circles known as schiltrons, wooden spears angled outward in spiked formation. For a time, they held. But the English cavalry adapted, and longbowmen rained death from afar. The schiltrons collapsed. Wallace's men were butchered, and though he escaped with his life, his position did not survive. He resigned his guardianship. He became a shadow again, a fugitive, a myth in motion. Over the next several years, Wallace disappeared from the chronicles. He may have traveled to France seeking support. He may have returned secretly, striking at outposts and fleeing before dawn. What we know is that by 1305, he was betrayed, captured near Glasgow by Sir John Menteith, a Scottish knight who had once shared his cause. There was no battle, no stand, no final act of glory. Wallace was taken in chains, dragged across the border to England. His trial would not be fair, it would not be long, because it was not about truth. It was about anatomy. Edward I had waited nearly a decade for this. The Scottish problem had dragged on too long. Nobles could be negotiated with, lands could be taxed. But Wallace had proven immune to those pressures. His body was the last thing that could be broken, and so it would be, piece by piece, in public, so that every sinew would scream what law alone could not articulate, that resistance to empire ends not in exile, but in slow, ritual obliteration. On August 22, 1305, Wallace was brought to Westminster Hall. He was not allowed to speak in his defense. He was stripped, mocked, and read his charges: treason, murder, war against the king. He denied none of it. He simply denied that Edward was his king. And in that one refusal, he sealed not only his sentence, but the architecture of his destruction. The punishment would follow the ancient code reserved for traitors: hanging, drawing, and quartering, the most violent, intimate, and symbolic execution available under English law. It would begin not with death, but with degradation. He would be dragged through the streets, tied to a hurdle, scraped across stone. Faces would leer from alleyways. Children would be taught by spectacle. Then he would be hanged, but not until death. Just long enough to rob his body of strength, then opened, then emptied, then cut, then carved. The body, once a symbol of rebellion, would be disassembled, not to be buried, but to be displayed. A limb in Newcastle, a leg in Berwick, a piece in Stirling. His head, tarred and nailed to a spike, would rot above London Bridge, not as warning to him, but to every thought that might echo him. Wallace had risen not with crowns or papal blessing, but with fire and resolve. He had no birthright, no inheritance, only conviction, and it was that conviction that had to be severed, not just in him, but in all who watched. August 23rd, 1305. The sentence was not improvised, it was not personal, it was codified, sealed by crown and court. William Wallace, branded a traitor to the English king, would suffer the penalty reserved not just for those who betrayed the state, but for those who dared to do so with conviction. The execution would follow the precise choreography of hanging, drawing, and quartering, the most anatomically exhaustive sentence in medieval English law. Every movement, every cut, every display had precedent. This was not vengeance, it was theatre, legalized, orchestrated, and public. The first act was degradation. Wallace was stripped naked and tied to a wooden hurdle, a flat frame of planks lashed to horses. He was not led, but dragged, face down, back scraping against stone and filth, through the crowded streets of London. His flesh tore on the cobbles, muck and excrement clung to his skin. Children shouted, rotten food struck his exposed body. The crowd had gathered not for justice, but for ceremony. They had been taught what treason looked like. Today, they would learn how it died. Westminster to Smithfield was not a short journey. The dragging was slow, deliberate, so that every soul in the city might see the man whose name had become both symbol and threat. At Smithfield, the platform had already been erected. There was no delay. He was lifted by the neck and hanged, not until death, but until the edge of it. The rope pulled tight, his legs kicked, his vision dimmed, his throat bruised. But before his mind surrendered, they cut him down. This was not mercy, it was design. Death was postponed, consciousness was required, for the next stage depended on it. They laid him out, supine, restrained. The executioner approached with tools clean but not sterile. There would be no quick death, no killing blow. This was anatomical deconstruction. First, the genitals, removed, held aloft, burned before his face. The symbolism was unmistakable. The man who birthed rebellion would be unmanned before the crowd. Then, the abdomen, a cut made deep. The intestines pulled slowly from the cavity, coiled like rope, steaming in the open air. His stomach convulsed. There is no consensus on whether Wallace screamed. Some say he did not, that he bit his tongue to silence. Others say he cried out, not from weakness, but defiance. What is certain is this: he was alive while it happened. The heart was next. Reached through the breach, torn from his body, shown to the crowd, then thrown onto the fire. He would not be buried whole. He would not be honored in death. The executioner's blade then found the neck, swift only because there was nothing left to sever. His head, severed, was tarred and placed on a spike above London Bridge. Crows circled, eyes rotted first. The smell clung to the air for days. But that was only the beginning. The body, what remained of it, was not buried. It was quartered, cut into 4 pieces, each limb packed and sent north. Stirling, Berwick, Perth, and Newcastle each received a fragment, displayed at gates, mounted on walls, left to decay where the people passed. These were not memorials, they were warnings. Each dismembered part declared, wordlessly, "This is what becomes of those who reject the crown. This is the fate of defiance. It is tempting to see this cruelty as exceptional, but it was not. It was procedural. Hanging, drawing, and quartering was the state's most complete form of execution, designed not merely to end a life, but to erase an identity. It was punishment that unfolded in stages, so the body could be transformed in real time from man to object, from object to symbol, and from symbol to silence. Wallace's execution was more than physical torture. It was a demonstration of power as domination over narrative. A live body, deconstructed with precision, to show the living how little the law cared for dignity once sovereignty had been challenged. And still, even in the face of this suffering, Wallace offered no submission. He did not beg, he did not recant, he did not accept the premise of his guilt. To the end, he denied that Edward I had ever ruled him. That denial turned the knife. It denied the king not only political obedience, but the victory of spiritual conquest. The purpose of torture in the medieval state was never simply death. It was conversion. It was confession extracted in blood. Wallace's refusal to speak the lines written for him shattered that aim. His body broke, but his defiance remained unyielding. The crowds who watched that day were meant to absorb a lesson, to feel fear crawl beneath the skin, to understand that rebellion is a crime not only against law but against the body. But some, even then, saw something else. Not a traitor, a man unmoved, a face that did not flinch, a voice that did not beg, and that too spread. The state had executed William Wallace, but it had failed to silence him. The body had been divided, but the act was not complete. The final stage of Wallace's execution was not anatomical. It was territorial. The quarters of his body, once living tissue, were repurposed into instruments of psychological warfare. Each fragment was sent not to oblivion, but to places that had once spoken his name in defiance. Stirling, where he had crushed the English at the bridge. Berwick, reclaimed in his uprisings. Perth, once a rallying point. And Newcastle, across the border in England, where defiance would be remembered in a different tongue. These were not random choices. Each destination was a message carved in sinew. It said, "The rebellion is dead, and this is all that remains of its voice." At each gate, his limbs were nailed high, left to rot in public view. Time did its work. Muscle darkened, bone splintered, crows settled. Children were taught to point. Travellers passed beneath his remains and whispered of consequence, but even as Wallace's body decayed, the purpose behind the display sharpened. This was not merely a punishment, it was an erasure. Medieval justice did not only seek to kill the man, it sought to cauterize his memory, to desecrate his physical form in such a way that his legacy would dissolve into horror. No grave, no prayers, no last rites. His body was unholy, his death unclean, his parts made into warnings. What Wallace was meant to represent had to be unmade, undone, atomized into terror. But it did not work, because dismemberment carries a strange power. It fragments the flesh, but not always the idea. What was meant to end Wallace instead dispersed him, into geography, into rumor, into folk memory. No matter how high they raised his limbs, they could not lift the shame from their own law. The execution had followed the statutes. It had been signed, witnessed, enacted with full authority. But authority does not always bring absolution. In attempting to unmake Wallace, the state had exposed itself. It had shown its need to not only control the body, but humiliate the soul. And that need was too loud to ignore. Edward I had ordered it all, the dragging, the hanging, the butchery, the scattering. But even he, Iron King of England, would die 2 years later. His bones would rest, but his conquest would not last. Scotland remained unconquered. Robert the Bruce would rise. The Bannockburn fields would see another English army shattered, and the memory of Wallace, quartered but unforgotten, would hover over it all. Not because of what he built, but because of how he died. Even in the final act, as his head blackened on its spike above London Bridge, Wallace's silence remained intact. He had spoken no plea, no confession. He had given the state nothing but the one answer it could not absorb: refusal. In that silence, there was power. The executioners wanted a performance. They got a void, no cry to sanctify the law, no sob to humanize the punishment, just flesh torn without narrative. And that is what haunts, because the most terrifying executions are not those filled with screaming, but those where the victim says nothing, where the body dies, but the idea remains whole. The state can draw and quarter a man, but it cannot quarter what he means. They scattered his body, but not his meaning. They burned his entrails, but could not cauterize what lingered in the minds of those who watched, or whispered, or remembered. William Wallace was not erased. He was multiplied. Every fragment they nailed to a gate carried not a warning, but a question. What kind of power fears an idea enough to torture its flesh into silence? The English crown had tried to write authority and anatomy. Each phase of Wallace's execution was meant to speak without words, to demonstrate that power could reach inside a man and turn his body into a lesson. But in doing so, they revealed a deeper truth, that sovereignty rooted in fear will always overreach, that empires which must destroy to assert themselves are always at core afraid. Wallace's death was not the failure of a man. It was the exposure of a system, a monarchy that claimed divine right, yet needed ropes and fire and steel to hold the illusion together, a kingdom that demanded submission and could not bear to look into the eyes of someone who simply said, "You are not my king." That is why Wallace remains, not as fact, not even as legend, but as disruption, because the state that sought to destroy him used its most sacred tools: trial, sentence, execution, and yet the outcome was not silence, it was memory. Not the memory of rebellion's failure, but of its necessity. In Wallace, we see the anatomy of narrative control, how pain becomes policy, how death becomes spectacle, and how, in the end, some bodies cannot be forgotten because their refusal to kneel tells us more about freedom than all the laws that tried to crush them. If you want to hear more of the stories they tried to bury, subscribe. We don't just remember, we reveal.